So yes, I think the US is an empire in decline, but I'm not one of those observers who say, yeah, that's great. We'll have a Chinese empire. That will be wonderful. No, I don't think so.
You're listening to the Corbett Report.
Welcome, friends. This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com coming to you in October of 2023 with a very special conversation with a guest that I hope will be familiar to my audience. But if not, well, then you're in for a treat. Today we're going to be talking to Dr. Daniele Ganser, who you will hopefully know as an historian, an energy and peace researcher, the head of the Swiss Institute for Peace and Energy Research, but also, perhaps equally notably, as the author of some important works, including NATO's Secret Armies, Operation Gladio and Terrorism in Western Europe, and, most recently, USA, the Ruthless Empire. Two books which I will commend to your attention today. The links to these books will obviously be in the show notes for this conversation, and, well, we'll get into some of the details. But first, let's welcome him on the program. Daniele Ganser, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Hello, James. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
All right. Well, I suppose since this is your first time on the program, we'll get into a little bit about yourself and what motivates you, but let's do so by recourse to your latest book, USA, the Ruthless Empire, which I definitely do commend to people's attention, and we'll get into the specifics of it. But I guess instead of me trying to summarize it for you, why don't you summarize it for the audience? What is the overall thesis of this book, and what were you hoping to accomplish by writing it?
I wrote this book because I think the US has a lot of influence on international politics, and everybody who's interested in international politics must look at the US. It's a country you cannot neglect, really. It's still the most powerful country, obviously has an influence on the war in Ukraine. It has an influence on the situation of Israel. It has an influence on Libya, on Iraq, on Afghanistan, on Chile, on Vietnam, on so many other countries. And I wrote this book for beginners, really. It's not for, you don't need any pre-knowledge to read the book. And I also write that the US is run by an oligarchy. That is my conviction, and I get the data to nail it down. Because I say it's 330 million people who live in the US, and they're being lied to about all these wars that the US is involved to through corporate media. But the small group which is really running the US, they make a lot of money, and the average man on the street in Florida or in California doesn't know these things. Yeah, I say in the book that the US is the country which has bombed most countries since 1945. So I call it the Ruthless Empire. That's the title, US, the Ruthless Empire. But I really stress that it shouldn't be confused the US population on the one hand and then the US government on the other hand.
Right. I guess it is important to define our terms if we're going to be talking about an empire, and even that term. Certainly not, I would imagine, in my general audience, but out there in the world, the idea that the U.S. is an empire is still, to some, a contentious idea. And, of course, again, this will not be news to people in the Corbett Report audience generally, but I did very much appreciate, you say this is a book for beginners, and it certainly does cover a lot of information that people in the alternative media space may have heard before, but with a lot of detail that I think will be appreciated by some people. One that I appreciated was this quote, which I'd never seen before, which is apparently from a House of Representatives document. Most people in this country, even the educated ones, know very little or nothing at all about our overseas possessions, said a U.S. report from World War II. In fact, most do not even know that we have such overseas possessions. They believe that only foreigners, like the British, have an empire. Therefore, Americans are sometimes surprised to hear that we, too, have an empire, which is a pretty startling admission from a U.S. government report. I'd never seen that before, so I appreciate you bringing that to my attention. And it's, I think, a little handy nugget to keep in people's information arsenal to wield against those people who say the U.S. isn't an empire. But as I say, I imagine most of the people listening to this conversation right now are on board with that idea. But let's talk about that that empire, what it really means, and how it operates. As you say, it's an oligarchy, and you do have an entire chapter with a lot of information devoted to that. But let's break down how that oligarchy functions and what this empire actually does.
Yeah, I mean, you're right with that quote. So it's a book not only for beginners, but maybe also of interest to those who have already, read into the topic. I hope to sort of reach both groups. And how does this empire work? I mean, in history studies, I have a PhD in history, and I'm a Swiss historian. We look, for instance, at the 19th century, and we say, okay, the British Empire controlled India, or the British Empire controlled parts of Africa. We have the French Empire. They controlled, for instance, South East Asia, what later, was Indochine. We have the Spanish Empire. They controlled parts of South America. We have the Portuguese Empire, which they controlled parts of what is today Brazil. So we're basically used in Europe to speak about empires. It's just one country which has a lot of influence on the other country. And in the US, it's also, within the traditional way of speaking that the British obviously were an empire, or the French had an empire, or the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. So in the American writing system, they usually say, yes, empires existed. There was basically from Europe colonizing the rest of the world, and colonialism and imperialism are evil, and that, thanks God, is all over. That's the way it's often said today. And I contradict, and I say the US is now the empire. It's just much smarter, the way that, for instance, the US empire has influence over Germany is there are 38,000 US troops in Germany. And the US has a lot of influence on the German media scene. But it's not, officially, Germany is not officially German, a colony of the US or Japan. There's a lot of US soldiers stationed in Japan. And obviously Japan has, a degree of freedom to do what it wants. But it cannot, tell the US soldiers to leave tomorrow. That's not possible. So the U.S. empire is maybe what we can call an empire that you can't really see so quickly. It was much easier to see the Roman Empire, or the British Empire, or the French Empire, or the Spanish Empire. But nonetheless, it is an empire because no country has so many soldiers overseas, more than 200,000 stationed in, as we said, in Germany, in Japan, in South Korea, in Cuba. Guantanamo is a very well-known military base of the US, stationed also in Italy. And, it's interesting to see that these military outposts are regarded as, oh, yeah, gee, we have these military outposts in Japan, but, we're not an empire. But if Japan had military bases in Florida or in Idaho or in Maine, wherever, any of the states of the U.S., that be critically recognized. So really, it's a question of perspective.
One of the things that I appreciate about this book, and one of the reasons why I think it would make a nice addition to most people's bookshelves, even people who know some of the broader details about what's discussed here, is that I think it does a great service in connecting to communities that are often disconnected, and that is the sort of the peace movement more generally, and the conspiracy realist movement. And those, there has been a wedge that is often driven between that. And I know there are a lot of people in the peace movement generally who don't want to be seen as one of those crazies who believe weird things about 9/11, etc. And I appreciate that this book does not shy away at all from asking the important questions and pointing out false flag events, conspiracies that have happened, talking in length and in detail about WTC7 and Dr. Leroy Halsey's study, etc. Again, I think it's valuable that those two communities are brought together, because it seems to me that if there is to be a genuine, real resistance to this empire and the way that it functions, we have to be aware of one of the most basic tactics and techniques that it uses, the false flag events and other types of ginned up atrocities, etc., that are used to perpetuate the war cycle which feeds the empire itself. Can you speak to that connecting of those two communities?
Yeah, James, I'm very happy that you actually see that I try to connect these two groups, because, when Bush attacked Iraq in 2003, President Bush, and overthrew Saddam Hussein in Iraq, that was obviously an illegal attack, and there were protests all over the world. I was myself with my wife protesting in Bern in Switzerland, which is the capital of Switzerland, against the attack on Iraq. We were protesting against Bush and against Blair, and many from the peace movement were there. Okay, so protesting against the attack on Iraq was something which happened in New York. There were peace movements there. It was in Los Angeles, it was in Rome, it was in Paris, it was in London. And that was just a flagrant violation of international law. Obviously, Bush and Blair didn't care whether we were protesting or not. They bombed the country nonetheless. But I would say that was a basically traditional position of the peace movement, that you don't bomb other countries like Iraq. And the peace movement obviously was also protesting against the bombing of Vietnam, bombing children with napalm and with Agent Orange, and, killing all these women and elderly people. I mean, people were outraged at that time, and rightly so, till today. So I was not alive in the 60s. I was born in 72, but I would have joined definitely the protesters who said we don't want to drop napalm on that foreign country, which has done no harm to us. So yes, I take the Iraq War, I take the Vietnam War, I describe the peace protests that happened there, and I fully back these people. But I then go one step further, as you rightly say. I go into Pearl Harbor, for instance. That's the entry of the U.S. into the Second World War. And there I say, we really have to distinguish between what the president knew, Roosevelt, and what the population knew, and what the soldiers in Pearl Harbor knew. And then I explain that according to the way I see the data, President Roosevelt really knew that the Japanese were attacking. The U.S. population didn't know it, and the soldiers stationed on Pearl Harbor didn't know it. So what I say, and there's a whole chapter on Pearl Harbor in that book, I say it was a Lee Hop operation, let it happen on purpose. And I have some data to back it up. I mean, I say Roosevelt wanted to go into the war. He wanted to fight Japan, and he wanted to fight Germany in the Second World War. We're talking about 1941. But, the country, there were a lot of people who didn't want to go to war in the U.S. There was a very strong isolationist movement. There was a strong peace movement. They didn't want to go to war. And to drag them into the war, the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, said, we can basically get us into a confrontation with Japan. First thing we have to do is just basically cut off the oil supply to Japan, because they need the oil dearly, and we have it in the US. And so that was done. Roosevelt did that. He cut off the oil supply. And the ONI then further suggested we should, the Pacific Fleet, the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which was based in California, we should move it to Hawaii, a bit closer to Japan. It's like, you put the meat in front of the lion's cage, so when he comes out, it's closer. And they did that. And Admiral Richardson, who was the commander of the Pacific Fleet, I explain it in the book in further detail. He said that's insanity. We should have the Pacific Fleet home base in California, not in Hawaii, because the soldiers want to go for a weekend and see their girlfriend. And if we have supplies, it's much easier to have the home base in California. And that was all true. But Roosevelt, he just fired Richardson. And he was the admiral in charge of the Pacific Fleet. And he put in husband Kimmel. And Kimmel was then stationed in Hawaii, new base of the Pacific Fleet. And when the Japanese attacked on 7 December 1941, he was left out of the loop. He was not informed. He was not informed that Roosevelt and the whole cabinet in Washington had intercepted the communication of the Japanese. That was the magic data. And we now know as a fact that Roosevelt let this happen. And I have a quote from one of the Office of Naval Intelligence officer who says, because he was asked, you sacrificed 2,400 U.S. soldiers. And then he said it was a cheap price to pay to then have consent within the United States to go to war against Japan and Germany. So when you say on one level, you're with the peace movement, against the Vietnam War, against the Iraq War. And on the second level, you go deeper and you look at conspiracies, because that clearly was a conspiracy. And it was a conspiracy of President Roosevelt against the American population. And I think it's important for the peace movement to look at that data and not just say, well, that's nonsense. So I take in Pearl Harbor. That's one, Pearl Harbor, 1941. I have the Kennedy assassination, where I basically said the CIA killed Kennedy. I mean, we can talk about it in further detail, but I'm not going like, oh, yeah, Lee Harvey Oswald did it. So I'm saying, yeah, that was another conspiracy. And I'm saying 9/11. I mean, these are the big three, Pearl Harbor, JFK, and 9/11. On 9/11, I say World Trade Center 7 was blown up. It was controlled demolition. And obviously, you're right. These are topics that divide the peace movement, or because some people say, I don't want to hear about it. This is crazy stuff. But as a historian, I'm just trying to do my job as good as I can and as independent as I can. And when I saw World Trade Center 7 coming down, it was not hit by a plane. And the BBC reported about that collapse at 5 o'clock, but it only collapsed at 5:20. So they reported 20 minutes too early, which is totally unacceptable. And the building went against its own footprint. I mean, I don't have to explain it to you. I know you're very knowledgeable about all that, but it's true. I tried to write this book for both the peace activists who are just generally opposed to war and torture and lies, but I also wrote the book for those who try to look behind the curtain and who are not afraid if somebody calls them, oh, if you look behind that curtain, you're a conspiracy theorist. They go like, I don't care whatever you call me. I want to know what's going on. And they just look behind the curtain. So I wrote it for both groups.
It strikes me that is a type of bravery and integrity that should not be so unusual in academia or in the field of history. But unfortunately, it seems that it is. So I very much appreciate that. And for people who don't understand about yourself, maybe haven't read NATO's Secret Armies or don't understand the significance of a work like this, I don't want to ask you to blow your own horn, so to speak, but it is important that people understand that you did some very pioneering research into the NATO Secret Army, the Stay Behind / Operation Gladio armies that were being puppeteered by NATO in Europe in the post-World War II era, that was somewhat acknowledged in the early 90s, and there was a slow process of information coming out, but still there had been remarkably little research. When you decided to make that the topic of your PhD dissertation, what an interesting topic, and I would assume that is where you got your baptism, as it were, in being called a conspiracy theorist and being told not to look into certain areas. Tell us about the experience of writing NATO's Secret Armies.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I wrote this book, NATO's Secret Army, and the subtitle is Operation Gladio and Terrorism in Western Europe. And that's my PhD. So I put, 4 years into this of my life. And I really spent a lot of time working on this. And what I can say is, oops, sorry, this is not very solid. Put this here, maybe that one. What I can say is that people don't know what Operation Gladio is. I mean, ask your average friend and ask him, how about Operation Gladio? What do you think about it? They go like, Operation Gladio, and they basically say they know the film Gladiator. Then they go, yeah, that's a film which is really cool, but it's like 2,000 years ago, where the Gladio is this short sword. That's a Gladio. And that's also the reason why it was called Operation Gladio. But in the historical context, the main person there is Giulio Andreotti, who was the Italian prime minister, and he blew the whistle in the year 1990. So that's just at the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And in the year 1990, there was a bit of a transition period in Europe. Many things changed. Germany reunited. The Berlin Wall had fallen in 1989. So it was a period where we had secrets from the Cold War coming to the surface. Very interesting. At the same time, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and then we had Operation Desert Storm and all that. But Giulio Andreotti was an insider in Italy. He was prime minister, and he really knew Italian politics inside out. And he said, there's a secret army in this country. And people were like, really? Are you kidding? Because obviously there cannot be a secret army in a country. If you have an army in a country, the leader of the army, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the generals, they have to be known. The defense minister, he has to be known. The size of the army has to be known. The budget of the army has to be known. And Giulio Andreotti said, well, this army is secret. We didn't, Parliament didn't know about it, and judges didn't know about it, and journalists didn't know about it. Professors at universities didn't know about it, and people on the streets certainly didn't know about it. So there was a huge scandal. It was called the scandal of Gladio. And then the Belgian defense minister at the time was in Italy, and he was, talking to Andreotti, and he was going, well, but that's typical Italy. You have all these secret structures. I'm so glad we don't have that. And then Andreotti said to the Belgian defense minister, well, you have a secret army in Belgium as well. And, he literally, his jaw dropped, and he was going like, what? I'm the defense minister. I mean, I should know about it. So he flew back from Italy to Belgium. His name was Guy Coem. And he talked to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and said, I have something to ask you. Do we have a secret army here? And then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, yes. And then the defense minister, Belgian defense minister, said, why am I not, in the loop? Why I'm not being informed? And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, well, defense ministers come and go. We're here, professional military people, and we're here to stay. And that was a huge scandal, because at that point you could really say defense ministers in some countries were not informed. In Switzerland, which is not a NATO country, we had Caspar Filigo, who was the defense minister. Now, Filigo was not aware that there was a secret army in Switzerland with the code name P26. And when the scandal broke, he said, I didn't know about it. So it was not only that people on the street or journalists or people in parliament didn't know about it. Some people on the level of defense minister had no clue. And when I looked at the data in more detail, I found out that these secret armies had been set up by the CIA and the MI6. And William Colby at the time in the 70s admitted that these secret armies existed, and then it was forgotten again. And Giulio Andreotti then confirmed, yes, these secret armies existed, and the overall name is called Stay Behind. And the idea is, if there is a Soviet invasion in Western Europe, then these secret armies would become active in the sense of a guerrilla network. They would use explosives and guns and just small guerrilla tactics to blow up supply lines of enemies who would then occupy Western Europe. So NATO had a meeting in 1990. Because it was very embarrassing for NATO, because Andreotti said NATO is coordinating this. And the Supreme Allied Commander Europe then said, okay, well, let's have a meeting. And Manfred Wörner was the Secretary General of NATO at the time, and he said, "This is explosive, and let's see that the media doesn't dig deep." So on one day they said, "Yes, we had a secret army," and on the second day they had another spokesman coming forward in Brussels in NATO headquarters who said, "What we said yesterday is wrong, and furthermore, we cannot comment on Gladio." It was really funny.
And I love the little nugget that you have in your book that they even denied the existence of that previous spokesperson who admitted NATO's role in Gladio to you, right?
Yeah, it was a total. I mean, yeah, they messed it up. I mean, it's one of those things where you say that's the way you shouldn't do it. But then they had a closed meeting of just NATO ambassadors. We're still in the year 1990. So that is now exactly 33 years ago. So many people don't know it. It's just history. And these NATO ambassadors came together, and most of these NATO ambassadors didn't even know, okay? So even on the level of NATO ambassadors, it was top secret. And the problem that we have now with Operation Gladio is it is known that it existed. We have, confirmation from former generals who were in the networks. It is known that it existed not only in Italy, but also in Greece, in Turkey, in Germany. In Germany, we had former Nazis who were in the network, so that's also confirmed. We had these secret armies in neutral countries like Sweden and Austria and Switzerland. We shouldn't be, because it was a NATO network. Why have them in neutral countries? And why have former SS people in Germany? And why have, there's lots of questions coming to mind. It's really quite the opposite of what you learn when you study history or international politics. If you study politics, let's say you're 20 years old, then you go like, okay, democracy, it works like that. You have the executive branch with the president and the defense minister and the foreign minister and the boss of the CIA and whatever. But you also have parliament, the House and the Senate. And they really control what the executive is doing. I mean, they control that. That's how it's done. And if something is done against the law, then you have the Supreme Court who will really say how to stick to the law. I mean, that's what you're being told when you're a student. And, you take notes and you say, oh, okay, the executive is controlled by the legislative branch and the judicative will intervene if there's a problem. And then you look at real life and you find out the legislative branch, so parliaments all over Europe, had no idea. They just had no idea. The judicial branch, they never even touched upon the topic. And within the executive branch, you had the level of need to know that some were informed, others were not. So I wrote the book from that perspective and said, okay, this is clearly unacceptable. You cannot call yourself a democracy when you don't even know whether you have a secret army or not. I mean, we're not talking details. These are armed people. And I got a lot of criticism for that because some people in the secret army said, how can you sort of criticize us because we prepared for a Soviet invasion and that was a sensible thing to do? And I say, I understand that. Okay, I understand that. But still, you should adhere to the rules of a democracy. And so the second problem that we have with these secret armies that I think is that they were linked to acts of terrorism. Now, that is very, very difficult to prove. I have to say that. I mean, on the one hand, we know that there were acts of terrorism in Italy. Bologna is the most famous one, but we also have Piazza Fontana with Bettiano. That was all in the Bologna was 1980, but 1969 was Bologna and it was Piazza Fontana in Milano. So with a lot of acts of terrorism where people in public places were blown to pieces. Okay, so that was clearly an attack on the civilian population in Italy. And we also have attacks in Belgium, the Brabant massacres in the 80s, where people who went to supermarkets were just gunned down and killed. And they even waited for the police to arrive and finish them off right there. So these were brutal killers. And then in Greece and in Turkey, we had coups d'etat. And then the question arose, if we had these secret armies in Western Europe, and that's a fact, were they involved in the killings in Belgium, in the terrorist attacks in France, and in the terrorist attacks in Italy? And furthermore, were they involved in the military coup d'etat in Greece in 67 and in Turkey in 1980? And James, that, as you feel, takes the question to a highly sensitive level, because here we're talking about huge crimes, okay? And still today, I cannot 100% say, the CIA was involved in the coup d'etat in Greece, or was blowing up people in Italy, or was blowing up people in Belgium, or the MI6 was doing this, because the CIA and the MI6 would always say, yeah, it's true what the Swiss, historian found out, or it's true what Andreotti said. We had these secret armies, but they were just there, set up to fight in case of a Soviet invasion. They were never meant to attack the population. That's just one or two crazy people we had no control of, who then linked up with other crazy people, and these crazy people carried it out, and that was nothing we wanted. So, it's the plausible denial thing that they do. But I'm not convinced, because what I see is in Italy, for instance, they linked up with Ordine Nuovo. That's a right-wing terrorist organization. And Ordine Nuovo carried out the terrorist attacks. That's for sure. That's proven, they had investigations after investigations in Italy. And I speak Italian, so I can read this data. And that's what we call first level. On the lowest level, right-wing terrorists carried out these attacks in Italy. Then there's a second level, which we call the Italian Military Secret Service, CFAR, and others. They were involved. So the American Secret Service linked up with the Italian Secret Service, and they covered this, okay, especially for the attack in Peteano in 1972. We know that one guy who was responsible, Vincenzo Vinciguerra, he was in Ordine Nuovo, and he was protected by the Secret Service. And when he was arrested, he said there is a secret army in Italy called Gladio, and nobody believed him. But he was one of the guys who had carried out the terrorist attacks. And he made this comment. He said the state cannot find out the truth on this, because the state is responsible for what happened. And when he says the state, he means that deep state, that secret branch of the executive that is hardly controlled. So there is data that Operation Gladio was linked to terrorism and to coup d'etats, and that's in that book. And it's obviously delicate, and many people don't want to talk about it.
Well, not just delicate, explosive, literally explosive. And unfortunately, I mean, again, I hope people can at least appreciate the efforts and the lengths that you went to in the production of this book, including getting and then translating many of the documents here. You've done really important research here, so I hope people have this book on their bookshelf. Can
I explain how it happened?
Yes, please do, yeah.
I was working on Cuba, on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I looked at different, analysis of it and everything. And then I wrote a small book on the Cuban Missile Crisis and the debates in the UN Security Council. I went through all the data in the Security Council, and I said, that's really interesting. And I sent my analysis to Noam Chomsky, who was then professor at MIT. And who had written really good analysis on the Cuban Missile Crisis, I thought, and then on the Bay of Pigs invasion. And I sent it to William Bloom, who wrote that book, Killing Hope. So that was in the 90s. And that was actually the first time I was writing emails at Basel University, where I was just a small little student. I wrote my emails to Noam, and I wrote my emails to Bill. And they were so kind to respond. Okay, I was just a small little Swiss student. And then they said, yeah, Dan, you did some good work there in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and thanks for sharing it. And then I wrote, I'm now looking for a PhD topic. And then Noam and Bill both said, we have a problem over here. Most of us don't speak Italian, and we don't speak French, and we don't speak German. Now, if you want to research Operation Gladio, that'd be good, because you speak all these languages, you're in Europe, and it has to be, the big problem is translating it all. There is data, but the data is in many different languages. You could research this as your PhD topic. So I wrote back, well, that's a great idea. I've never heard of Operation Gladio, but I speak many languages and I could go ahead. And then they helped me with contacts in Europe, who then helped me with gathering the data. So really the hint came from the US, from the US peace movement. I mean, Bill Bloom is in the peace movement, Noam Chomsky is in the peace movement, and they both don't speak Italian.
Yeah. And have shown aversion to some of the conspiracy topics written about in USA Ruthless Empire as well. Chomsky does not like 9/11 Truth, for example. So
no, he didn't like that. No, but I met him. Then I traveled to Boston and we met. And you know, I don't have the same perspective on Corona or 9/11 as he has, but I think he was doing excellent work on U.S. imperialism, and so did Bill Bloom. I mean, Bill Bloom. I still have his book. Yeah, Killing Hope. He's dead now, but he was such an excellent scholar, saying, you know, that's not acceptable. We cannot just overthrow the government in Guatemala of Arbenz in 1954 or overthrow the government of Mossadegh in 1953. And he really explained to me. I then met him in Washington, and he had all this data, and he was really a data guy. And he said, oh, you know, have you seen this? Have you seen that? Have you seen that? And he said, he's generally part of the U.S. peace movement. He said, I completely disagree with my government. Why do they do all these illegal things? And you know, most people here who live with me in the same block, he was just living from modest means. He's not having a huge house and the swimming pool. He was, I don't know, on the 10th floor in some huge block. That's where we met. And he said, you know, people, my neighbors to the left and the right, they watch television and believe what they're seeing, and it's just not the truth. But, you know, I tell you the story, first, because I've not shared it very often, and second, because I want to pay tribute to the U.S. peace movement, which really helped me. I mean, I got the data from there, or from people who worked at the National Security Archive, NSA.
Well, I appreciate the work that you put into that book. Before we leave the Gladio topic, I should ask you if you have been following the trial that is set to take place, is taking place in Italy right now. Earlier this year, Marco Toffoloni, a 66-year-old now, he was 17 at the time of the Piazza della Loggia bombing in 1974, and he has just recently been charged with taking part in that bombing. And according to some of the coverage, this may lead to some more specific links between Ordine Nuovo and the NATO secret armies. So have you been following that at all? Do you have any information about that?
I do follow it, not on a daily basis, but I get the data, you know, as summaries from people who help me. But it's in Italy, they call it terzo livello, which means the third level. And the third level is actually the link from, I mean, as I said, the U.S. empire has military bases in Italy. That's, you know, public knowledge. I mean, everybody knows it. And from these U.S. military bases in Italy, there were oral commands to right-wing terrorists in Italy. That's very hard to prove. I mean, how do you prove that as a historian? That some senior U.S. officer in one of the military bases in northern Italy, in Verona or in other places, talks to a right-wing extremist. I mean, they wouldn't put it down in writing.
Unless they die in a car crash in Susurluk or something like that. It's hard to find evidence, right?
Yeah, that was the one thing which helped obviously a lot to dig deep in Turkey. But otherwise, you don't get them in the same spot. It has to be this freeze moment, as we had it in Susurluk. But that was a rare case in Turkey where you got them all together. But the Piazza della Loggia bombing, 1974, is certainly one of these big terrorist attacks. And you know, the difficult thing for Europeans, that's taken on a very general level, to understand is that the US had a strategic interest to carry out terrorist attacks in Italy. Because your average student of history or your average mother sitting in an Italian cafe would say, are you crazy? Why would the US kill people in Italy? And so these trials that are going on are important because they show the historical strategic context. And as I said before, Italy is a NATO country, but Italy also had a strong communist party. And if an Italian defense minister, never happened, there was never an Italian defense minister. But if the strong communist party in Italy had reached positions in the executive branch of influence, like defense minister or interior minister, they would have betrayed the secrets of NATO to Moscow. Because the Italian Communist Party was obviously linked to the Communist Party in Moscow. We can talk about how strongly and how independent they were, but there were links. That's undisputed. So NATO was fearing that there should never be a communist defense minister. So how do you weaken the Italian Communist Party? Well, one idea, a cruel idea, but this is the strategic thinking behind it, is you carry out terrorist attacks in Italy, you use the extreme right, like Ordine Nuovo, and you blame it on the communists. That's what we call false flag terrorist attacks in the context of strategy of tension. Now, most people don't know what false flag operations are, and most people don't know what strategy of tension is. But false flag is actually simple to understand. It's just you shoot yourself in the foot and then say, my neighbor did it. I mean, that's a false flag. And everybody will think, well, you're not going to shoot yourself in the foot. Nobody would do that. So it has to be the neighbor because there's just two people in the room. It has to be him. Okay, that's false flag. Or when the CIA bombed Cuba in the Bay of Pigs, they painted on the planes that they used to bomb Cuba, FAR, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, which is Spanish, and it's just the name of the Cuban Air Force, tiny Air Force of Fidel Castro. That's false flag. You just pretend that you're somebody else. And strategy of tension is the other one. You create tension, and tension is not for the one who are dead. People who are dead have no tension at all. It's the tension in those who survive and who see what happens. And you can create tension in Italy by killing people, lots of people, 10, 20, 50, or 3,000 in the US on 9/11. It's just then you create tension among those who observe it. And you then introduce a scapegoat, like the Italian communists did it, or Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan did it. And then on an emotional level, people are so confused at the moment of 9/11 or at the moment of Piazza Fontana or Bologna that they're unable to think. Because if you create a lot of emotional tension, a human being is not able to think. Then they just are bewildered. And historians then come in much later. I don't feel well, not much. I don't feel that the tension that people have felt during these terrorist attacks. And I can look at it calmly and go like, oh, gee, this happened. Oh, gee, that happened. Okay, so the right-wing terrorists were doing this. Oh, they blamed it on the left. Oh, okay. Oh, and then they found out that the military secret was involved. Oh, interesting. Then I found out the military secret was cooperating directly with the CIA. Oh, interesting. So I go from primo livello, secondo livello to third level, terzo livello. So yes, I follow this, but it's a complicated story, and I'm glad your audience is ready to think about it, but most people, like 90% of world population, is not ready to think about it.
We have a long way to go, but we have made progress, I would say, in recent years in introducing this terminology to the public, and I think more people are aware of the concept of false flag now, thanks to the efforts of researchers like yourself.
Thanks also to your work. I mean, it has to be said. Given the credit.
I do appreciate that. I appreciate you mentioning the Corbett Report in the book as well. I do appreciate that. And as you say, I think, yes, this is where all of the dots of our conversation start to connect, because you raise the specter, for example, of the false flag in Cuba, which in Bay of Pigs, and painting up planes with Cuban Air Force colors. But also, of course, the idea of a false flag in Cuba should probably raise the minds in Corbett Report listeners of Operation Northwoods, the plan signed off on by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, specifically Lyman Lemnitzer, to commit false flag attacks in the United States as well as in Cuba, and blaming the Cuban government, and et cetera, et cetera. And what happened to Lyman Lemnitzer? Oh, that's right. He was sacked, essentially, or shuffled sideways to become Supreme Allied Commander of Europe for NATO, in which he was obviously playing a part in the Gladio operations that were going on there. So what an interesting circle. And it brings us back to the concept of the USA Ruthless Empire and its organs and tentacles all around the world. But as I say, there's so much information in here, some of which will be new, even to people who've been researching this for a long time. Some of it will be review material. But I always want to take a look at the other side of this. Yes, there's the documentation and the information that we can glean about the problem, but really, the fundamental question is, what is the solution? And when it comes to the question of a ruthless empire, a world-bestriding empire that has been built up over the course of at least the last century, that is an overwhelming question. And I think there are two aspects to it. There's the macrocosmic and the microcosmic. So the macrocosmic perspective on this would be the geopolitical perspective. Is there a way to, say, dethrone the U.S. empire, or to stop or derail its progress through world history, or is this an inevitable progress? And then there will be, of course, the question of the microcosmic. What can individuals in the peace movement actually do about this? Let's start with the geopolitical context of it. What is your analysis of the USA empire and where it's going from here, and what could happen geopolitically to derail it?
On the geopolitical level, the empires always come, then they have a strong time, and then they have a decline time, and then they're gone. I mean, that's always like that. It's really like the waves on the ocean. If you're sitting if you're sitting on California beach and you see the waves, they come, they go, they come, they go. It's everything in life is like that. I mean, these are, deep spiritual wisdoms that nothing is there forever. I mean, you are not there forever. I'm not there forever. Our time is ticking away. We don't know when we die, and the same for all our listeners. We'll all come and go like waves, and the same is true for flowers. They bloom, they blossom, they die. The same is true if you have a dog. If your dog is a small puppy, he grows bigger, and then he dies. If you have a horse, same story. And if it's an empire, same story. Every empire comes and goes. So the Roman Empire is no longer here, and everybody knows that. The French used to control large parts of Africa, no longer. The French used to control Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, no longer. The Dutch had Indonesia, no longer the case. The Spanish had most of South America, no longer the case. So it's normal that empires come and go. Like the British Empire, I mean, the British are a shadow of what they used to, of the influence they used to have. And now, so historically speaking, yes, the US empire will go as well. The problem is it's not necessarily speaking better if we have a Chinese empire or a Russian empire or a BRICS empire. Empires, as a historian, I just don't like empires. I wish we could have a world without empires. Whether that's strategically possible, I don't really know. But it's quite obvious that if you look at the world, you have 193 UN member states. So Switzerland is one, Japan is one, China is one, US is one, Mexico is one, Nigeria is one, and New Zealand is one of these 193 nations. I said before that these 193 nations are not of equal power. And 31 nations are within NATO. They are NATO members. So now Finland has joined, so it's now 31, but it's basically North America and Europe. That's the NATO countries. And these 31 nation states, I've done the numbers, they have about 1 billion people who live there. Out of 8 billion, 1 billion lives in NATO countries. Now, the problem is that the news that we're reading, CNN or Fox News or Washington Post or New York Times or German news or The Guardian or what have you. That is all within the NATO language communication universe. It's always saying, there's no U.S. empire and there's no Operation Gladio, and 9/11 is, as George Bush told us. And these are all fairy tales. It's all fairy tales, not true. Might give you a good feeling if you believe it, but it's not true. Nothing to do with facts. And then I always say, if you take these 31 NATO countries, that still leaves you with 163 countries which are outside of NATO. And if you go to these countries, Switzerland is one of the 163. We're not a NATO country, but we're surrounded by NATO countries. Then you see, okay, there's a different perspective. And if you go into the BRICS countries, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These 5 BRICS countries, they have a population of more than 3 billion. So NATO countries, 1 billion, BRICS countries, 3 billion. Then you look at the data in the BRICS, and you look at the debate. You look at the debate on 9/11 in China, or in India, or in Russia, or in Brazil. It's a completely different debate. They say, probably there was controlled demolition. Within the NATO countries, there is no controlled demolition. Why? Because there can be no controlled demolition. and in the BRICS country, you have much more open debate. Now, because you talk about, how do empires come and go? The interesting point here is, and your audience probably is well aware of that, because I think you have a very highly educated audience, is that the BRICS are now 5, but in 2 months, in January 2024, next year, the BRICS will become a bigger club. Iran will join, Saudi Arabia will join, Argentina will join, Egypt will join, the Emirates will join. Have I forgotten somebody? Ethiopia, I think. So they will go from 5 to 10 or more. They double. So the BRICS get bigger. And that means an empire like the US empire has a bigger challenger. It's not China alone. It's China in the BRICS context. And there I see the petrodollar as the key question, because the petrodollar obviously gave the US empire a huge advantage because they could just print their money. And that's always something very handy if you can print your money. And as long as the dollar was backed with gold until 71, it was a solid structure. Then it was backed by oil, basically. All oil was sold in dollars. And now Saudi Arabia joins the BRICS in January 24. For me, as a historian, I can't really say what the future will bring because I couldn't predict Corona. But when Saudi Arabia joins the BRICS group, that will certainly weaken the petrodollar, certainly. And that, furthermore, will add to the decline of the U.S. empire. So yes, I think the U.S. is an empire in decline, but I'm not one of those observers who say, yeah, that's great. We'll have a Chinese empire. That will be wonderful. No,
I very much appreciate that you make that point because, yes, certainly the debate on 9/11 in China or Russia is much more open than it is in the United States, but the debate on Tiananmen Square or any other number of... I invite you to go to China and start criticizing the Chinese government. Actually, I don't invite you to do that because you'll probably never be seen again. So, yes, the idea that a Chinese empire would be preferable to U.S. empire is, I think, the wrong emphasis to put, especially for people who genuinely desire peace. And I think that brings it back to that level, the microcosmic level that I was identifying of individuals in the peace movement who genuinely do desire peace. As we sit here in October of 2023, potentially facing another regional war that could engulf the entire world, who knows? It's a very unpopular position to genuinely hold a thoroughgoing peace position at this point, unfortunately. But it's one that I think needs to be defended all the more vociferously exactly because of that point, and not by rallying around another national flag. Oh, let's all just now China will be the saviors of the world. No, I think we need to reject that thinking altogether. The question is, how do we do this? And you identify 3 things in this book that you think are important things for the peace movement to pick up on and to center their activities around. Tell us about those 3 things that you identify.
Well, the first thing is that we should stop using violence to solve a conflict. That's just a very general thing. And there's a lot of people in the peace movement in Israel right now who say, no, I don't agree. If my government, if Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the prime minister of Israel, if he now flattens the Gaza Strip and kills everybody there or displaces these people, that's not going to help. So that's people in Israel in the peace movement who very clearly say, let's not solve our conflicts with violence. And there are people in the US in the peace movement who say, let's not bomb Iraq. That's not a good idea. Let's not bomb Libya. And there's people in Russia in the peace movement who say, let's not invade Ukraine. It's not a good idea. And I agree with all these, okay? But they are in different countries, but they all agree that as human beings, we have conflicts, which is normal. I mean, everybody has a conflict with if you have kids, you can have conflict with your kids. If you have a wife or a husband, you have conflict with him. That's all normal. I mean, conflicts are all right. I'm not the guy who's saying we shouldn't have any conflicts. I mean, conflicts are part of our experience as human beings. But the tipping point really is if we solve our conflicts with violence and not, and if the wife just poisons the husband because they have a conflict, I'm saying that's wrong. Or if the husband just shoots the wife, I'm saying that's wrong. The conflict must be solved without violence. And that's the position for the peace movement on all issues. It's not just on the private issue, it's also on the issue of Israel and Palestine, on the issue of Ukraine and Russia, of the issue of how does US and China, can they coexist with China gaining more influence? Do you need to, sort of go into a conflict in Taiwan and make the whole thing blow up? No, you don't. We can really coexist if we learn to solve our conflicts without violence. I know it sounds like a far-fetched thought, it's something, it's not going to work, and the Swiss historian is just having no clue. I mean, we're always going to kill each other, and how stupid do you have to be to say but really it's like when there was slavery, to say, oh no, slavery will be there forever, and how can anybody think of that this will at one point be looked at as not a good idea. And I hope that we reach this point with conflicts, that we still say we will always have different ideas and different perspectives and different religions, and we'll eat different food and listen to different music. I mean, you probably listen to different music than I do. We actually don't know what music we listen to, but we both wouldn't shoot each other because we listen to different music. Or, I mean, it's just a crazy idea, the shooting. So I really say most people on the planet don't kill each other. Most, like 95%, make it 98%. It's only 2% who are involved in intensive killing, maybe even less. But this group needs to be convinced by the much larger group that we shouldn't do it. And there I say the prohibition of violence, as it was put down in UN Charter in 1945, it basically says all nations shall refrain from the use of force in their international relations, even from the threat. They shouldn't threat other countries. So that was put down in 45 and then forgotten. I mean, but it's a jewel, and we should really dig it up again and say, let's take just this international law, which is there, and implement it, and not, send tanks across the border. That's the first thing. The second thing on a private level is really that I say we should overcome nationalism, because the Germans and the French killed each other in the First World War, and they really had no clue who the other guy on the other side of the trench was. The US soldiers based in Iraq who killed Iraqis, they had no personal problem with the people that they were killing. They were just sent there, and then they killed the others because they heard this story of weapons of mass destruction, which was lies, or that Saddam had anything to do with 9/11, which was lies. So these 20 or 25-year-old soldiers are being fooled. They're being fooled. They're being, sacrificed. And when they come back, they're not being taken care of. So I also speak in the name of the soldiers who were fooled and who come back with one limb and traumatized. And I tell them, okay, the nationalism has gotten on the flag. If you run with the flag and say, my government has the total wisdom and this is the flag. You can carry any flag. It can be the Israeli flag, can be the Ukrainian flag, can be the US flag, can be whatever flag. You're being fooled. So I say, let's overcome nationalism. It's very difficult. Some people say, oh, what an idea to overcome nationalism will never work. I say, yes, the peace movement is already overcome nationalism. We feel that within the peace movement, we're strongly connected, much more strongly connected to each other than to our nation state. Like, I can really criticize the Swiss government and say, it's wrong that we take sides in the conflict, Ukraine and Russia. We should be neutral. So I criticize my own government, and the people in the peace movement in the US do the same, and people in the peace movement in Israel do the same. So they are overcoming nationalism. And let's understand that we are actually a human family, that everybody is a brother and a sister, everybody. And then people go like everybody? Like, okay, my friends, yes, but not the Taliban, right? I would say, yes, also the Taliban. They're like, what? The Taliban are my friends? I'm not saying they're your friends, but they are the human family. Then I say, but the people in the Israeli defense forces who are now bombing the Gaza Strip, they're not part of the human family. I say, yes, they are. And the Hamas, are they part of the human? Yes, they are as well. So everybody is, yes. And the concept that I have in mind is that we should treat them with respect. It doesn't mean we should go on a holiday with them, but we should just not kill them. That's the basic thing. Don't kill each other in the family. And this is an idea that tribal people understand very well. They say, okay, within the family that we don't kill each other. But they say we can't kill the other ones from the other tribe. Okay, but that's tribal thinking. And we've sort of evolved from tribal thinking into nationalism, which is another form of tribal thinking. And I say, let's move one step further and say the whole world is one family. And let's not kill each other. So I speak about this concept of human family in my talks. I always say that. We're all part of human family. And then the third thing that I recommend is that we do meditation, really. I mean, that we train ourselves to become more mindfulness training. This is a training which is popular in the peace movement. A lot of us do yoga or reflect on their own pains that they have from could be their childhood or divorce or financial bankruptcy or whatever they've lived through. Most of us have a few years on their shoulders, so we have a few years to reflect upon. And if we watch inside and look at all these wounds that we have, and we do some healing on our own wounds, then we cannot be so easily manipulated by war propaganda, because people who are just not reflecting their own trauma, they are being pushed around very, very easily. So I say this mindfulness training basically says that you observe your own thoughts, that you observe your own body, you observe your own emotions, but you are aware that you're not your body or thoughts or emotions, but you're the consciousness which keeps everything working. And on that level, you cannot be confused so easily by television or politicians who come, and say, kill this guy or kill that guy. You go like, that's an interesting thought. How did it come into my brain? Oh, I watched this television show. But then you watch your thoughts and you go like, oh, I have this thought. How did that end up in my brain? And you really train your own awareness to observe your thoughts, and you just don't believe everything you think. You just, reject some thoughts when you say they're outdated and let in new thoughts. And James, I just have this belief that as a human family, we have extreme potential. I mean, it's not that the 2023 edition is not as the best we can do, right? with much more potential, much more. On an individual level, on a family level, on a friends level, on a collective level. But we really have to shift up one gear. I mean, the way we do it now is we're stuck in nationalism, pick a side, kill the other group. We're stuck in front of TV, believing lies. The governments here and there, I'm not saying one government is telling lies. All governments across the world are telling lies. Sometimes more, sometimes less. But it's scary when they say we should kill people here or kill people there. And then people from Germany go with the Bundeswehr to Afghanistan and kill people in Afghanistan. I mean, it has happened. It's not just these things I observe. So I think we can shift up one more gear, and then the peace movement can become stronger. And I'm this positive thinking person. I think we have the potential. Obviously, I don't know where we are in the year 2030 or in the year 2040. But all those who have kids, and also those who don't have kids, are generally interested in peace. They think long term. It's about the year 2050. It's not about the year 2024. And if we think about the year 2050, that's 21st century. For many who have kids today, that's a period where their kids will be alive. And so we have vested interests in the year 2050. So I'm a strong believer in the peace movement.
Well, as the great philosopher William Patrick Corgan Jr. once observed, these times too shall pass, and the U.S. empire too will one day pass. But what will be on the other side of that? What will replace it? And that is the question that, as I think this conversation has demonstrated, is not going to simply be about geopolitical calculations. It's going to be about the people who are on the other side of that collapse. What do we do as humanity to fill that void of power? And it strikes me that the logic of empire is the logic of cool rationality and calculation of material benefit of this or that maneuver. And it appeals to people on that level. Don't worry, if you're part of the empire, or if we take you under our wing, we'll make sure you have riches and material benefits. But that's why I think it is so important for us to be able to tap into the greater human potential that sees beyond simply the material comforts and wealth and riches, and starts to appreciate something beyond that. And for the religious, it may be prayer. For the non-religious, it may just be mindfulness or meditation, as you point out. But at some point, we need to connect with something that is beyond just the logic of empire. And it's extremely fitting that you bring up the concept of, say, slavery. Perfectly, totally accepted by pretty much everyone a couple of hundred years ago. How could you possibly be against slavery? And yet now, obviously, it is, well, still unfortunately practiced, but certainly almost universally condemned. And on that note, you had a quote in here from abolitionist Ezra Heywood writing in the 1860s that I thought was extremely appropriate. I will probably make a good use of this quote, so thank you for bringing it to my attention. He wrote, "War is wrong. Wrong yesterday, wrong today, wrong forever. Self-defense is right, but how much of yourself will you save? The self is composed of soul and body. To save your life by sin, you lose your soul. To lose your life for truth, you save your soul. I go for the soul." What a beautiful quote, and I think something that probably puts a nice bow on this conversation. Unless, Dr. Ganser, is there anything else that we haven't covered today that you'd like to address to the audience?
No, it's a wonderful quote. I mean, that's really how I see it. I fully go with that quote. I think we have a soul, and the soul lives on when the body dies. And the soul tells us that we shouldn't kill the others. We know. It's not that the soul sometimes says, well, you can kill 10 if you get 20 million. That'd be a good idea. No, don't kill anybody. The soul knows that. And you said maybe one thing I might add. You said people who think we need to get richer and we need more wealth. It's maybe not a coincidence that I'm based in Switzerland. I know what richness is. Nice house, nice car, everything. I see it in Switzerland. But I tell you that we have people who are rich, commit suicide, who are in depressions, who are in burnouts. So it's not on the material level. We will not be successful. It really has to be on another level, on the level of soul, meditation. This level. That's where we can make progress. Not by buying more material goods. That's not going to solve the problem. We tried that.
Right. Well, that's probably a deeper conversation than people might have expected today, but I hope they appreciate it, and I hope that this at least drives people towards the books, which I will commend once again to everyone's attention. I think they would be extremely valuable if you're interested in the Corbett Report material, you will be interested in both of these books. So I will, of course, again, put the links in the show notes. And Dr. Ganser, thank you very much for your time today. I hope that we can talk again in the future, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for digging deep.